everybody, and welcome back to the Responsible AI Report. I'm very excited. We have Sophie Compton joining us today. Sophie, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Such a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
It's so great to be chatting with you again. We had the opportunity to collaborate together earlier this year when the Responsible AI Institute put together a panel on managing the risks of generative AI, which of course you've done a lot of work in as a director and producer in the realm of deepfakes, which I'll be excited to get to. I'm really enthusiastic about the work that you're doing. I feel strongly that it's through storytelling that we're able to reach people, to spread awareness on a variety of these different topics. And so it's great to have you here, especially as we dive into,
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I think it's a really timely conversation because especially here in America, as we're going into the election cycle, and there's a lot of concern around this, I think that it's important to hear from leaders like yourself when it comes to just your experience in research with AI deepfakes. NBC News put out an article recently about this new public service campaign featuring celebrities like Rosario Dawson, Chris Rock, and Laura Dern, which aims to warn Americans about AI-generated deepfakes that could mislead voters about election information in 2024. And the campaign, which was organized by a nonpartisan group called Represent Us, uses deepfakes of some of the celebrities themselves actually in their campaign just to illustrate the point. This PCA, of course, comes out amid growing concerns of AI's potential to confuse voters through the use of deepfakes. So I would love to use this article as a jumping off point, Sophie, and just from what you've seen in your work, how do you believe communities can protect themselves against these targeted forms of deception?
I actually think it's very hard for this to be addressed at an individual level. So most people, if you get presented with a deepfake video, you're likely not going to be able to distinguish the difference between that and a real video. Like, yes, there's a role for media literacy, and yes, we should all be, conscious, like self-aware citizens as far as we can. But I think that really this needs to be approached in a structural way. And I think that it's about consent. The issue of deepfakes is an issue of consent, especially the issue of deepfake abuse in the context of non-consensual pornography. In the case of electoral interference, I think it is a very concerning aspect of this problem. I do always want to balance that with the reality that 96%, I think it's actually I think it might be 98% of deepfake abuse is non-consensual porn of women. So the real issue that we have right now in terms of how deepfakes are being used to affect societal ill is around pornography and is around a violence against women issue. That's not to say that there isn't serious threats of electoral interference, but I actually think that the bigger threat, the way in which AI is used to affect elections in, I think, very damaging ways so far, is more so around how algorithms can increase radicalization and polarization. And mis and disinformation, in many cases, is not actually deepfake. There's a whole range of mis and disinformation that may be AI generated that does not have to be a deepfake video. So I think that we need to be thinking about like the information ecosystem, but particularly who is moderating the content that we consume online. Because I don't think it's realistic that there are kind of community generated initiatives that try and spot or redress an issue of, a deepfake getting out. I think that we do always need to be aware and conscious of what we're consuming, and especially if something feels dodgy around an election, if somebody tells you that your voting has been extended, like obviously question that. But I think that the real change needs to come from oversight into social media sites and platforms and all of the places where fake news is disseminated, and their leadership and their content moderation policies.
Yeah, you make a really good point that so much of what's happening in the election cycle, both in America and abroad as well, is misinformation, and that ability to be politically polarizing, and just some of the misinformation that is getting misconstrued, and everything kind of lost in interpretation. At the same time, there's a lot of people that are promoting the advantages of AI as well, and how AI can do a lot of good in the future as well, whether it be through creating engaging content, or using it as a tool to promote good in a variety of different industries. Based on your work and what you've done, and the obviously the documentary you created, Another Body, do you see positive sides of this technology as well? And if so, where are you seeing that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think all technologies are tools. They can be used for good and for ill. We, in our documentary, Another Body, which follows a student's experience of being deepfaked into pornography without consent, and her fight to try and get justice in the US, where there isn't a federal legislation around deepfake abuse, and in most states there is no protection whatsoever. But we reclaimed that technology in order to protect her identity in the film. And it felt really important to us to be presenting that positive message about how this technology can be an incredible tool for storytellers, for filmmakers, to allow somebody to speak a story that they would never be able to tell if their identity was known. So that could be somebody fleeing a domestic violence situation, somebody in a war zone, somebody that has to be in a witness protection program. These are all people that historically would only ever be able to speak, with a kind of shadowy shot from behind, or their face blurred out, their voice changed. And those are all it's quite hard to engage with them on a human level. And what's uncanny and miraculous and terrifying about this technology is that it really does capture the spirit and the emotions and the personality of the human being underneath, and that is kind of transmitted through the digital veil. So I think that there are so many potentially positive uses for the technology, and again, it really comes back to the infrastructures and the ecosystem, and I really want to emphasize that, because I think one of the real challenges that we see in the way that deepfakes have been allowed to proliferate is the kind of complicity of the mainstream tech platforms. Companies like Google, who have been massively promoting non-consensual abusive content, and making it possible for there to be this flourishing of sites that are dedicated to commissioning, producing, disseminating non-consensual intimate image abuse. We got to a situation where a well-known US politician, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, comes up with a bill about deepfake abuse. And if you Google her name, what comes up is not her thoughts and her bill and her activism around that, but it has historically been non-consensual intimate image abuse of her. And I think people don't understand the depth that of the impact of that. It can be so psychologically damaging, even if, it can be extraordinarily damaging to ordinary individuals, hugely damaging. It can affect your body, your identity, your trust in your relationships, maybe you don't trust your boyfriend, maybe you don't want to go back to school, maybe you really fear, the consequences in your workplace, you might lose your job, all these things. And even in the case of someone who's a really outspoken, pretty hardened political operator like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, the felt reality of that and the disconnect and the way that your identity has been wrested from you is still felt. So I think we need to both see the potential in these technologies and then look at, what has actually gone wrong? And it's really, I believe, the kind of tech infrastructure and the tech ecosystem that is allowing the bad actors to win out and that is failing to protect innocent people.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. There is an accountability that is lacking in so many ways, especially with regards to how big tech is operating and addressing these issues. The fact that when you put in the Google search, as you were saying, and what comes up, is that it seems like that would be such an easy fix. And the fact that that's not the case, or rather that it's not fixed, is a big issue. And I know for myself, it makes me wonder, okay, what are what are the more complicated, what's kind of that dark underbelly then? How deep does this go? And I would love to kind of dive into that a bit as well. What do you believe are some of the biggest risks you see with AI deepfakes that you've observed in your work that may not be present at the moment, but that you see down the line if these issues don't get fixed now?
What we see with deepfake sexual abuse is the silencing of women and minoritized people. This is a highly gendered issue. 96% of deepfake abuse is of women. Every single woman that I've talked to that's been targeted by this, and I've spoken to many people that has been silenced in some way. Some have decided not to continue their job. Some have dropped out of college. Some have actually taken their lives. There have been people who have taken their lives as a direct result of this kind of abuse. And even the ones, as I was saying earlier, that kind of are very strong and actually refuse to be silenced, in such extreme ways, they are combating so much more in just the everyday living of their life. And I think that Tim Berners-Lee, the kind of inventor of the internet, said that he believes that online gendered violence is the biggest threat we have globally to gender equality. And I completely agree. And I think it sounds a bit hyperbolic to talk about the mass scale silencing of women, but I really don't think it is, because what's happened with deepfake abuse is that it has been allowed to become mainstream. And that means that, groups, and often it's, young men or boys in the schoolyard, on a campus, a lot of this is starting very young and not being told culturally that this is not acceptable. So they think it's a bit of a joke. They don't realize the repercussions. And I can understand that, because they're not getting the clear cultural messaging. The law doesn't say it's not acceptable. Taylor, when she went to the police about her experience of being deepfaked, the police said he had every right to do that. And they also victim blamed her, which is very typical, and said, what did you do to call this upon yourself? So culturally, the messaging that these young boys are getting is that this is okay. So what happens is that they then share the video, and the video circulates, etc., etc. And the number of young women who I've spoken to who say, I am so afraid of this happening. I'm afraid of stepping out of line. I'm afraid of being loud. I'm afraid of posting that picture on my social media profile. When people watch our film, so many people at the end of the film say, I need to delete everything. I need to make my profiles private, etc. And I completely understand that. It's a very rational response. But my argument is always actually, please don't do that. We need to be able to exist fully as human beings on the internet. The internet is the biggest public forum that we have. And if women are self-centering to the extent that we already are, that is just such a concern. That's such a concerning thing, even for democracy. What we lose when all of those people are not being themselves, not participating fully, and not pursuing their dreams, pursuing the careers that they want, etc. But I really think that the level to which this has become mainstream and this has become widespread, and therefore the effect, the subtle and kind of almost indefinable effect it's already having on policing female behavior, it is so great. And we have to combat the mainstreaming of this issue if we have any chance of kind of reversing that effect that I think already has picked up pace, way more quickly than any of us would have hoped.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. It's because of films like yours that awareness is being spread about this. So then those conversations can happen for, children, for, young boys to understand, okay, this is what's happening, and this is why it's a serious issue, and this is why it's a problem. So as to not allow it to continue to grow and expedite and just become a bigger animal than it already is. I can't thank you enough, Sophie, for taking the time to join us on this show. Your work is so critically important in how we think about AI and how AI is being used and abused as well. And so I know for our listeners, they'll walk away from this conversation with more depth into how they need to be talking about AI as AI continues to develop, as regulation continues to be proposed and put out and enacted as well. And so you've given us a lot to think about. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us. Before we sign off, I'm wondering if you could just share with our listeners where they could find out more information and all of this incredible work that you're doing.
Absolutely. I guess like my kind of call to action would be that AI in and of itself doesn't have to be terrifying. It's in whose hands, in whose hands and what the objectives are around their decision making. You know, how quickly a new technology is coming to market, who's benefiting, who's doing the risk assessment, who's doing the content moderation, who's, you know, thinking through some of the risks. So I think I always like to try and bring a bit of nuance and a bit of hope to this discussion, because I think people can be very afraid. And I think that there are good reasons to. I think that there are some really scary developments of, especially like the impact of some really large language models, etc. But I think that for me, it's really about how we as a movement, where we place our energy. And I think it needs to be directed at big tech and those infrastructures, and questioning the biggest companies and holding them to account, and ensuring that governments are regulating those companies and that the governments are ahead of this problem. So yeah, the work that we do in raising awareness is under a campaign called My Image, My Choice. And I would really encourage anyone that wants to get involved in some of this work to follow us. You can find us like at My Image, My Choice on most social media, and also our website, myimagemychoice.org, I think. And yeah, I think that what we're going to need is the public to rally around and put their energy where it will be most effective, which I believe is directed at the big tech companies who have the biggest responsibility to ensure that AI is used safely and for good.
Absolutely. Well, I'll make sure to include the resources in our show description. So, for all of our listeners out there, I highly recommend scrolling down, clicking those links provided. There's a lot of great information. Sophie, thank you so much again for taking the time to join us.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. Great to talk.